this transmission is going to be for sale on eBay. If it says up in the description that it's for sale, then it is. But if it doesn't say for sale in the description, it's already sold. It will come with this adjuster. It will not come with this clutch arm, nor will it come with this clutch rod that goes through to the throwout bearing. You will get exactly what you saw me put together in the video. It will come with the kicker arm. So this is what you'll be getting if you buy this transmission. Okay, my YouTube people, this is the build video on the 53 Panhead transmission. You can see right here there's a 2 and a 3, so it was the second month of 1953. It has a 1E here, and the number is a 124-35. I'll attach a link to a video that explains all these numbers at the end of this video, so if you like, check it out. So start off, the part number is 34809-52. This is for a 53 Panhead transmission. Anytime I'm working on anything with a machine surface like this, I just like to put a flat file across it, make sure there's no burrs sticking up. And it's just that simple. And once you do that, it ensures that the gasket will have a good seal. You can see this top is in pretty darn good condition. It does have one broken spot here, one broken hole there. This one's cracked. It'll seal just fine with the rest of them. It's not going to be an issue, and I'll still put screws into those positions. Then after you flat file them, you want to make sure that you spray them out real good so there's no dirt in there anywhere. You want to make sure before you go and assemble anything that you have the manual. This is a copy directly out of the Panhead manual, and it walks you through this exact procedure. They talk about the alignment of the shaft onto the gear, the fact that the gear has a timing mark. I'll show you those as we move along. It also talks about making sure that the plate is properly aligned with the gear on the shaft. If you happen to get a transmission where this isn't together and you have to figure out the alignment, it's really easy. This side faces in towards the case, this side faces the drum, and then there's an alignment mark right here. Now I painted it, and I painted the teeth with white paint so I could see it from all sides, and it's really helpful. Also, for the alignment of the drum, you can see right there, there's a ground-in notch right there, and I just put another paint mark right here so I could see it while I'm putting it together. But there's clearly a grind mark right there. So the way this gear lines on the shaft when you put this together is like this. This alignment mark is just off of center of this first tooth. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's just off center. Nothing tricky about that. And then I have a new cotter pin to put it in with. First thing I'm going to do is start by putting a little grease on the shaft. Make sure it's well lubricated when it goes in. And I'm even going to put a little lube on the back side of it. I'm also going to put a little grease into the bushing. Now I'm going to install the shaft into the bushing like that. Next, the spring goes on the back side of the gear. So I'm going to install the gear and the spring. The way I do that is I just kind of line it up and I help it along with a screwdriver like that. Now I'm going to bring the timing mark up to the top. I greased inside the bushing. I greased the shaft. Now I'm just going to install it. And again, it's off the left side of the first tooth. Now I'm going to wedge a screwdriver down in there to get the gear back so I'm able to put the cotter pin on it. Now I'm going to slide the new cotter pin in. Once I see it turns nice and smooth and that the spring is holding the shaft where it belongs and it has a little spring action. Now once I open up the cotter pin a little bit, I just want to double check the timing. I put this spot right here straight up, and there's the paint for the tooth and it's in alignment. Now I'll spread the cotter pin the rest of the way. Okay, you can see that cotter pin is spread properly. Now I'm going to put the shift drum in. Proper way to get the shift drum in is to line the alignment marks. And I started on this side first, like that. And then you can see right there that the tooth is going to go right into that. just like that. Now the next thing you want to do is put the shifter drum shaft in. It's all nice and clean. The shifter drum shaft takes this flat O-ring on the second groove. Before I install any O-rings, I put a little bit of O-ring grease on them. This helps keep them soft for many years to come. That's the O-ring on there. Now I'm going to grease the shaft a little bit. When you install this shaft, it goes in this way, and down in this hole gets a set screw with a post on it, and that post goes down into this groove and holds it in place. Okay, now I got a light film of grease on the whole thing. I'm going to install it. You can see it slipped in there real nice and easy. Once you start getting close, you want to be really careful that you don't put it in too far. You want to watch down in this hole, and I'm sure that you can't see that, but you want to watch down in this hole and make sure you stop when it's aligned. So when it's right here, I'll just start getting in a couple little taps and watch. And right there, it's in perfect alignment. Here's that alignment set screw with the pin out the end, and this has been cleaned already, but I am going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on it. And I'm not going to put a lot. When you mount this, the mounting surface of the transmission will hold this in the gasket, but I like a little Loctite anyway. And you can see it went in very easy and down below the surface, and that's how you know you have it right. And that's what it looks like on the other side, just a little bit of that groove, and that groove is used to remove it when you're removing it. Okay, so now you just want to check the rotation and make sure it rotates freely. And it does. Rotates all the way to the last gear and stops. I can also see the grind mark on my drum gear that's right here going right into the tooth with the white paint. Right there. So that's how you know you have it right. The next thing that you want to do is install the shifter detent that holds this drum in gear when it's on the motorcycle. On this shifter drum detent, first gear is here, the little one's neutral, that's second, that's third, and that's fourth. And the shifter detent goes into this hole with the lock. This is the parts here for the shifter detent. You have the bolt that's hollow, you have the detent itself, and the one slope side is what goes on into this groove here. You have the spring and the lock. It's important you want to put a little bit of film of grease on this or oil, but you don't want to pack up in here with grease or anything like that, because it could hydrolock it and it not work and not want to go in or out properly. So if you notice, I just put a little coating on this, not really much at all. Then I just take and run it in the bore a little bit, and I'm just going to take and put an ever so slight amount on the spring. This will all get oiled up once the transmission has oil in it. So the way this works, the spring goes in, then the detent, and after that's together, then I like to put the lock on. So this just slides in here like this. Want to make sure that your locking tangs are facing up. Then it gets tightened with a 7/8 socket. I always like to make sure that the tangs on the lock are tight on the transmission. So after it's all in, I just like to give them a little squeeze. Like that. Now the nut's tightened in, I'm going to tighten down on the lock. Just like that. Now, when you shift, you can hear it. That detent goes into those grooves real nice. Please don't forget to like and subscribe on my video. It costs you nothing and it helps out my channel, and I appreciate it. I use nothing but James gaskets on all my builds, and this is the James gasket kit for this transmission. The part number is JGI 33031-70, and that fits from 36 to 86 4-speed transmissions. And as you can see, this is how the kit comes, and there's plenty of extra parts in here, because in 36 they did not have this starter gasket piece. That was more in the shovel head era, and this is for the entire transmission. Most of the parts in here will be used, but not all of them. These will be the first two parts I'm going to need out of this kit for this transmission. First thing you want to do is put this gasket on here, and then next this plate gets put on. If you notice, everything in here is very, very clean. I put this all in a solvent tank and washed it really good. And now I'm going to put it in. One thing I want to point out before I put this together, because it's a little harder to see once it's together, there's a notch right there. And when you're aligning this, that notch has to align up with one of these grooves. Each one of these grooves is one of the gears. You want to make sure that when you're aligning it, that your transmission is in one of the gears and not in neutral. It's important for it not to be in neutral. So this plate, it goes on here like this, and then it gets this lock washer and this screw. And of course, I put some Loctite on it. Doesn't need a ton, just enough to hold it. Now, you just want to snug this. You don't want to tighten it because you still have to align it. And again, that alignment, I want to make sure you can see this. That alignment is this tooth with one of these gear spaces. Not the tooth on the gear, but one of the spaces. And that's pretty good in alignment right there. And now you can tighten that down. Before you give it that last snug, you want to double check the alignment. Make sure it didn't move. This one does look like it moved a little bit, so I'm going to loosen it back up. Give it a little twist, like that. Now it's in perfect alignment. Now I'm going to tighten it up. Again, you want to double check that because this will affect shifting. And that is right on the money. Now when you put the cover on and you tighten it down, it'll tighten it down further. But you do want to make sure that that's tight because you don't want it coming out. Next thing I like to do is put a good bit of grease in here where the springs go. Make sure they're good and lubed. Then you also want to put some on this shaft where it's going to come through the plate. Make sure this is good and lubed. And even the gears. When I took this apart, this spring was broke, so I bought new springs. Put the first one in. Now put the other one in. Now that they're both in, I'll put a little more grease on them. The next thing that goes on is this plate. You want to make sure you grease the bushing here. Okay, the next thing you have to do is install these shifter pawls. These shifter pawls have a groove in the back of them here, and that groove faces away from you when you're holding the plate like this. And there's pins down in here that they align on. The book clearly states to oil these and not grease them. Then you put one in, like this one, push it down, you want to make sure it's good and free. Then you put the other one in. And that they go in real nice and easy, and that they move nice and free. Now you have to hold these on when you're putting them on that plate, and make sure they're down on the pins. And then this piece here goes in between the two springs. It's a little bit of a trick. You got to finagle it as you do it. Sometimes it could go real easy. Sometimes you could struggle with it. So we'll see. So thankfully it went in really nice and easy. Just push it down the rest of the way like that. The shaft should basically be flush. And then you can rock it back and forth and shift gears, and I'll show you what that looks like. You just take your shifter plate and put it on here like this. And then you should be able to shift gears. That's fourth, third, second, first. Now the next thing you want to do is you want to put the cover gasket on, and this gasket has a notch in it that lines up with this notch. Then you want to make sure you grease this real good because it rides on the cover, and then we'll put some grease into this. You don't want to be cheap with the grease. Okay, there it is all greased up. Again, there's a notch in this cover that gets lined up with the notch in the gasket and the bottom cover, like that. Okay, these are the screws that hold the cover on. If you notice, there's one that's shorter than the rest, and that one gets a nut, and it goes in the very bottom hole. Of course, you already know I'm going to Loctite these just a little bit. Now I'm going to install them. The short one goes in here. I'm going to put that one in next. Then I'll put the nut on the back. After you tighten up the screws with Loctite, you put the cover on like that. You put the arm on, can't get this stuff wrong. And then you put these 3 screws in, and I already have Loctite on these screws. Like that. So it's important after this thing's all built is to shift it through the gears. With the new springs, it makes it much stiffer. Right now it's in neutral and I can go to first. And first is kind of easy, but to get it into second, I have to turn it, and now it's in second, third, fourth. That's third, that's second, that's first, and then back into neutral. And that's how you rebuild these lids. Also, I want to point out that that looks like a crack, and that's just a casting mark. So now we'll move on to the transmission. This 53 case is in pretty nice condition, about as nice as you're going to find one of these. No cracks in it or anything like that. I took all the studs out and checked everything out down here. It does appear that the drain has a helicoil in it. The only part it does have is a little crack right here, the aluminum, but this adjuster will work fine without that. And later in this video, I'll show you what that looks like with the adjuster in. You wouldn't be backing the adjuster this far out anyway, and there's plenty of threads left in it to work just fine. So the first thing we're going to start off with is putting the mounting studs back in it. And those mounting studs look like this. And we're going to make sure that all the threads go into it when we put them in. Also, I'll be using plenty of red Loctite on these so that they stay in. And if they have to come out, you'll end up needing a torch to heat them up, and they'll come right out, as they did for me. The way I get these in is I double nut them and then screw them right in. As you can see, there's no shortage of Loctite on these. I won't make you sit through me putting all 4 of them in. Okay, now you can see I got the 4 studs red Loctited in, and they're good to go. After spraying with the Prep-All, I'm going to coat the studs with Gliptol to eliminate any leaks. Here's the can of Gliptol that I used. You can see I sprayed it in here. They recommend doing these because these old cases are really porous and just can have oil seep right through them. And I did that on the bottom, but I didn't go crazy with it. I just coated the bottom, and then where the studs come through, got a good coating. You could see it there also. Made sure not to get it on any of the bearing surfaces or where any of the gears ride. For some added protection on the mounting studs, I'm going to put a little thread sealer on the top of them right here. There you can see the Teflon sealant, and call me paranoid, but I don't like my stuff leaking. It's all double protected. Now I'm going to start to assemble the main drive gear or 4th gear. You can see this one's in excellent condition. No pitting on the teeth. It's nice and clean. The bushing's in excellent condition. This gear takes 44 of these needle roller bearings. I always check every single one. As you can see on this one, it's at 123. But you have to check them all, because what happens is they sell these in oversized as the gear wears. And I found one of those 44 that were at 124. So I have plenty extras. I'll set this aside, and I have 44 of the ones that are at 0.123. Whenever I assemble these needle bearings, I use assembly lube, or once this assembly lube gets up to temperature, it melts and it just becomes part of the oil. If you use lithium grease on this to assemble it, the lithium grease doesn't go away. It stays in here for a long time. The oil will get in, and eventually I guess it gets the lithium grease out. I never feel confident about that, so if I use assembly lube, I know it melts in and I don't have any worries. First thing I do is put some assembly lube on the backing spacer and put that on the gear, and those roller bearings will roll up against this. Next thing you want to do is you want to cover this real good in assembly lube, and then you put your bearings on here, and the lube will cause these to stick, as you'll see. Now you stack the bearings on here, and then once they're all stacked on, you cover the outside of them with assembly lube. It is important that you have 44 of these roller bearings, just like the manual says, and this is what that looks like. Now I'll coat the outside of them with some more assembly lube. Next, we're going to assemble the main shaft. I have a new main shaft bearing from Drag Specialties, part number 1106-0011. That goes inside this race piece here. You have the main shaft. You have what they call the shifter clutch, and this is marked high on this side. And this shifter clutch is in pretty nice condition. High faces 4th gear over here like this. You have a locking ring here. You have the washer. You have 3rd gear. It's in good condition. And last you have this. It's low gear and 2nd gear that goes in. And this goes on this shaft like this. Now I'm going to install the bearing into the race. Nice fresh new bearing. This bearing has a part number of 6305RS. Goes in here like this. Okay, now you can see that bearing seated completely. Now we'll put 1st and 2nd gear on the shaft and then the bearing. 1st and 2nd splined on, and now the bearing. And this bearing, the flanged area, faces the outside of the shaft just like that. Okay, I got the new bearing on the shaft. I have this tool I made a long time ago. This is a transmission seal installer tool. And when you put it on here, it presses right against the inside race of the bearing, which is the proper way to install that. There is no play on 1st and 2nd gear at all. The next thing we do is we install the shaft into the case. Then we install 3rd gear on after we lube it up. And then the washer with the 2 teeth and the lock. After that, we put the shifter clutch in. These are the 2 parts that hold the bearing onto the shaft. They call this the ball bearing nut, and they call this the ball bearing washer. Now you can see this has locking tabs and they're all gone for the nut. It goes on like that. And this nut, somebody used a chisel to get it off and ruined it. Not sure if it shows up on camera or not, but there's a crack right here. I dug in my stash and I have a real nice nut here. I have a real nice ball bearing washer with good locking tabs here. Now on this washer you have 3 tangs, and those 3 tangs go into the splines and up under the bearing. And that centers it so it can't move around. And then the next thing you put on is the nut. Now I'm just going to finger tighten this for now. I will torque it after I get it all together. But I also put red Loctite on this, so I don't want to put that on now because I can't torque it. Now I want to put some assembly lube where 3rd gear rides. Here's 3rd gear. I'm going to put a little assembly lube, make sure I get it down into those grooves. That way at no time is it running dry. Now I'll start the shaft into the transmission. I'll install 3rd gear. The brass washer faces out and the dogs face in. 3rd gear comes here like that. Next goes the washer with the 2 tangs. Then the lock washer. Then the shifter clutch. High faces 4th gear or high gear. Want to make sure that I lubricate the bushing inside of high gear. Okay, so I ended up having to take this transmission back apart. And what ended up being is this bushing that goes in 3rd gear was worn heavily here. And it was causing the gear also to rock around. Plus it wasn't tight in the gear. I could move it in and out. It's supposed to be a press fit. I pressed the new bushing in the 3rd gear. And you can see on this bushing when you look from the side, and I hope you can see this, that this one's flat along here. And this one has a bevel. And this bevel was completely worn off, causing the gear to move too much side to side on the shaft. Plus the inside of this insert was worn. So the gear was wobbling around a lot. Put a new bushing in it. Had the bushing honed out. And now this is good to go. Now that I have the shaft in, I'll push 3rd gear up on. You want to be real careful not to pull high gear or 4th gear out of here because those needle bearings will come out. I take a needle nose pair of pliers and I get that washer up on here. And you can see that'll spin with the shaft. I just push the washer on. And now you want to start the locking ring. Now that I have that locking ring started, I push it a little more together. Now I get the shifter clutch up on that spline, like that. And then you can use the shifter clutch to push that locking ring in and the screwdriver. Make sure you get it all the way down into the groove. Now you can see that this outer bearing piece is not into the case yet. You need to take a soft hammer and tap it in like this, but as you're doing it, you want to make sure that you hold fourth gear up against the case this way and just tap it right in. Once you get it all the way in, you'll hear it changes sound when you hit it. So now it's all the way in. You want to double check over here that all your bearings stayed in, and they did. And it still rotates nice and smooth. Want to make sure your shifter clutch is nice and smooth. I like to operate it, make sure it goes in the fourth. It does. Now push it over, make sure it goes into third. It does there. Then you want to make one more final check. You want to make sure that that snap ring is all the way in that groove, and you want to rotate your shaft around, make sure each section of that snap ring is all the way in the groove. And to verify that, make sure third gear can't come over towards high gear, and it can't. One other thing I like to do, and I'm not sure you can see it on camera, is where the opening for the snap ring is, I like it in between a tooth. That way you don't have a long piece of it hanging out where the valley is. And right there, it's right in between a tooth. I'm sure that, I would think that you probably can't see that on camera, but it is. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the retainer plate. And the retainer plate goes in like this, because the counter shaft, and I installed that just to show you, the counter shaft has a locking washer, and that locking washer goes up against this retainer plate like that to keep everything aligned where it should be. So I'm just going to lightly install 2 of these screws like that to hold the retaining plate in place. Again, I haven't torqued this nut yet, so I don't want to move these locking tangs over yet. Next, for the retaining plate screws, I like to put some Loctite on those, like that. Now start these 2 and Loctite the other 2. Okay, now snug them up. And before I put the last one in, put the oil deflector on. Now what I like to do is take a little adjustable wrench, put it on the square of my screwdriver, and tighten these screws up with it. I go across from each one. Now that I have the 4 screws in and tight, I'm going to go around to the main shaft and install the seal. Okay, you can see I have my seal in. I wiped the excess RTV off of the seal where it mates up, and it went in very easy. Had to give it some taps. Only thing I had to use was this mallet to get it in, which was pretty simple. Now, some of these gears have provisions where you can stick a seal down in here. This one doesn't. However, I always grab an O-ring, and this was out of an assortment I had, and I just get that O-ring and I put it up in there, and it gives it a little extra sealing. Now we're going to assemble the counter shaft gear set. And these gears look to be in excellent condition, along with where the gears ride on the shaft here. The bushings, they're in great shape. As you can see, the bushings are in great shape here. The dogs look like they're really nice. The clutch is really nice. The other gear looks really good. So what we're going to do is we're going to lube both sides of this bushing and install them into the gears. And then we'll install the gears onto the, and then we'll install second gear onto the shaft. First gear goes on at the end. But before any of that, the needle bearings go up into here. The clips are already in both sides. This was cleaned. This was cleaned very well. This is second gear, nice and lubed. Now we'll install the bushing. Let's take that excess and put it right in here. Okay, now we have this lubed. We'll install this. The dogs face out. And this just slips on there like that. Next thing that gets installed is the gear retaining washer, then the spring lock ring. This goes on first, then the spring lock ring. Again, when I install these, where the cut is, I like that in between one of these raised teeth. I don't like it over here in the groove in the valley because I'm afraid vibration will cause it to snap off over there. So I want to, like I said, install where this is in a tooth. You can see it's right there in the tooth. I want to make sure it's in that groove the whole way around, and it is. And then that the gear rotates freely. Now we'll lube first gear. Now we'll install the bushing in the gear. And let's wipe some of this excess off and put it on the inside of the bushing. I mic'd all the rollers and they're all the same size. They're all sitting at 0.123. And I'm going to install them into the end of the countershaft gear set. And the way to do that is I'm going to put the assembly lube in here and then stack the bearings in, and I'll show you that as I'm going. So on this side, you have to put the retaining ring in first. There's a snap ring down in there, and it gets this retaining ring. And then you put your 22 bearings in. On this side, I had to use grease instead of the assembly lube. Although assembly lube is definitely my preference, I had to use grease to get them to stay in. Okay, now that they're all in, it gets the retaining washer. After you install the shifter clutch, you have to install this shim. And then you install first gear. And it should be basically flush right here. Sticks out a little. Now you can install this into the transmission. Next thing we'll do is we'll put the O-ring on the shaft. Get the cluster down in there and install the shaft. When you go to install the shaft, you want to line it up best you can. And then slide the shaft in. Before you come out the other side of first gear, you have to put the shim in that sets the end play. Okay, now that I got the shaft in, I don't have it coming through all the way through first gear because I have to put the shim in and then measure the end play. This shim is 90 thousandths thick, so I'll put it in first and see where we're at. I stuck a 90 thousandths shim in there, and the clearance on the side play was only about 5 thousandths. Now I have an 85 thousandths shim, and I'm going to put that in and check the clearances. Again, you just back the shaft out. Now that I got the shim in, I'm going to check the gear end play. And right in the manual, it says it should be 8 to 12 thousandths of an inch. So you pull back on the speedometer drive, and then you slip it down in between the shim and the case bushing. And that's 8 right there, slips in. 8 slips in there. It's not too tight, it's not too loose. So we're going to leave it right there at 8. Next, you put the locking plate on, and then you just give it a turn to lock it in to the bearing retainer. Then you put the lock washer on. And before I put the nut on, I'm going to put a little red Loctite on it. As you can see, I didn't put a whole lot on, just enough. And with the locking washer, you really probably don't need it, but Harleys vibrate pretty good, and it's best to put it on. This nut's a 7/8 nut. Now I just lock it in 2 gears at once. Now it gets torqued to 55 foot-pounds. I got the 7/8 nut torqued to 55 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to bend the locking washer over. Just like that. Now I'm going to put the starter assembly back together. You have the starter clutch, the starter main shaft gear, the starter clutch spring, the nut, and the key. The starter clutch spring sits in the back of the starter clutch, and then that goes on together like this. I want to make sure that's not rocking around too much, that bushing's not worn, and it's not. Make sure that the spring's sitting right in the main shaft gear. Then you put the key in, and I just start it way out the back like this, and then the clutch. Then I just take and start that key a little bit with a small hammer, and then I put a punch on it. It's important to make sure that the key is all the way down in the keyway, because you have to put the starter clutch washer on, and it has this tab out the back that fits in there and holds it in place. And then lastly, the nut goes on, and then you fold over the washer. But I'm going to put some red Loctite on this. And now the starter clutch nut. That nut's 15/16. It gets torqued to 45 foot-pounds. Now the locking tab's bent over. Now you want to check to make sure it's working free. That looks good. Nice and free. And that's the end of the assembly on this side. Next thing we're going to do is put the Speedo drive in. Put a new gasket on it. And then you just want to turn it and make sure it's turning here, which it is. We'll put the screw in with a little Loctite. Again, just check it, make sure it rotates both ways freely, and it does. Next, we're going to put the counter shaft cover on with a new gasket. Since the counter shaft has a rubber O-ring on it to seal it, I'm not putting any goop on the gasket. So it takes 4 number 632 screws. Of course, I'm going to put just a small amount of Loctite on these. You can see it's very little. And there that is. Okay, next we're going to put the piece in for the kicker. Flat screws. And it gets 2 screws. We'll put some Loctite on those. They're in nice and tight. Next thing we're going to do is put the shift forks in. Always like to take a straight edge of some sort and make sure the end of the forks aren't bent, and they aren't. Either side. And then you check the other fork. Make sure they're not bent, and they're not. I'm not sure how good this comes out on camera. This one where the fork's offset goes to the kicker side, and the one that's equal goes to the sprocket side, and then both of these face out. So to slip this one in is real easy. Slip this one for main drive gear. You want to push the gear over towards 4th. Slips right around the speedometer drive gear, and in they go. Now you want to make sure you have the O-ring on the shaft, and there it is. I like to put a little bit of O-ring grease on that. There's the O-ring grease on it. Now you just slip this in like that. And then like that, pushes in. Next thing you want to do is put on the new roller shifter fingers. These are Harley part number 34168-39, and drag specialty part number is DS-193-146. They just slip on. Next thing you want to do is you want to center up the shifter clutch that's down in here on both of these. You kind of want to center it between your gears, and gives you a good start. Now, I do have the Jim's tool to do the alignment, but I found it's easier to do it without it, and that's just me. What you do is you just take your lid, you make sure it's in neutral, which it is, and then you center up your gears like that. You put it down on the alignment pins, and it dropped right on all the way down. I'm not sure you can see that right here. All the way down without having to move it at all. And then you just carefully take it off, and you want to make sure that your shifter forks are in the center. This one's perfectly centered, and the one down there is perfectly centered. So this one doesn't need adjustment. But if it did, there's shims right here on these forks, and you either take shims out or you add shims, and it'll move that fork over with the adjustment. And then the way to do that is you just loosen this nut. If it needs adjustment, you just take your shifter fork back out, and you can see right here there's shims. You would take this nut off and add and remove shims to get it where you want it, and then put it back on. And then after you put it back on, you want to make sure to bend your locking tabs like that, and then you'll put it back in. Again, it's in neutral, they're perfectly aligned. And it drops right down on that easy. And that's how I like to do it. Then again, I pull it up and double check it. You can see the forks are nice and loose on here. So that's set. You got your rollers on. And after you do that, this is the screw that retains this. And I like to put just a little bit of Loctite on that. It's very little bit, but it's enough. Sometimes you have to move the shaft around in order to get that to go in there smooth, like that. Now it's set, the shaft doesn't move. Next thing you do is get your nice new gasket and you put it on there. Get yourself back into neutral. Make sure they're really even, because that's the adjustment. And then the lid sits down on there just like that. Nice and easy. So now what I'll do is I'll put a couple screws in it and just make sure it shifts smoothly. Okay, so I have 3 screws in the cover. I'm going to go first. That's first. Then second. That's second. Now sometimes you're going to have to rotate the shaft because there it is. It dropped in all the way in the second. And that's third. You hear it drop in. And then that's fourth. Drops right in nice, shifting beautifully. Back to third. Second. First. Neutral. Okay, so this is your input shaft. This is your sprocket shaft. Now if I'm holding the input shaft and the sprocket spins, obviously neutral. So after you're sure that it shifts right with the lid on, you take your lid back off. Now you want to put your sprocket on. This one's 22 teeth. Then you want to put this cup back on. And then you'll put your lock and your nut. The sprocket cup. The lock. And then the sprocket nut. If you watch me by now, you know it's going to get some blue Loctite on this. You could also put red on this one. You wouldn't be wrong there. This one can be tricky to get off. So I'm just going to use the blue. And this one's left-handed. Again, I use my special tool for this. And you want to lock it in 2 gears at once. Like that. And then I'll lock this. And now this gets torqued to 100 foot-pounds. And I'm going to do that off camera just because of how I have to hold it. Now it's all torqued, and I'm going to bend over the locking tab that's most in alignment with the flat of the nut, which is this one here. Okay, as you can see, that's bent over. Okay, before I button this trans up, I want to put a little oil in it just to keep everything with a little bit of oil on it so you don't get any surface rust. And one of the things I'm going to do is put some Teflon on this drain bolt. And you can see I have an O-ring on there. I don't think they came with an O-ring, but I put a pretty small one on there. And it seems to work. So, okay, so there's the Teflon on it. Alright, now tighten that down. Okay, now I'm just going to put a little bit of oil over it. All my transmissions, new or old, I use Mobil 1 full synthetic, 75/90. So I'm just going to pour a little of that over the gears and rotate them around. Make sure that everything is covered. So now you can see I've got oil on all the gears, got it in between on the shaft and the gears. Now it can sit without any worries. So now that I got oil on the gears, I'm going to put all the screws in and torque the cover down. But before I torque them down, a little bit of Loctite. And now I'm going to torque them all to 95 inch-pounds. Okay, now they're all torqued down and the top's installed, ready to go. Okay, next thing we're going to do is get the kicker cover on. This kicker cover is in excellent condition. The way we get the kicker cover on is first we put a clutch rod in it to align the throwout bearing. And this clutch rod is not for this transmission. I'm just using this one for alignment. And then here's the throwout bearing right here. Now, the way this works is these two fingers down in here set in this groove. You kind of get it set on there like that. So the first thing we need to do is put these studs back in, and I've cleaned all these, and the fine thread stays out and the coarse thread goes in, and then I'm going to put a little red Loctite on them and I'll double nut them to install them, and I'll show you how that's done. The way I put the studs in is I put some red Loctite on them and double nut them and then turn them in. And once they're all the way in, you just take the nuts off, and that's it. Now I'll go to the next one. Now the studs are all in. Now you want to put your nice new gasket on. Okay, before you put the cover on, you want to make sure that you have this little spring-loaded ball set up top, and that indexes into this cutout in the throwout bearing, like that. And then it's all the way on, and then you can see the outer section's rotating while the inner is not. So then you just put that in here, put it in your cover, make sure it's indexed on the fingers, like that. You can see it is. And then just make sure this is at 12 o'clock. Well, that's at 12 o'clock. When you're putting the cover on, you have to make sure that this is in the right spot where it stops, so that your kicker's in the right position. So you can see that's all the way up. Now when you kick it, it comes down like that, and then when the spring returns it, it's going to want to stop here. But what happens is those two pieces I showed you on the kicker pedal, they push in the kicker gear and release the ratcheting part of it, like right there. That pushes that in, and now the transmission will spin and you won't hear that gear ratcheting the whole time. And it's the same when you kick it down. It pushes it out of the way so that when it goes all the way down, it's not engaged. When you come back up, ratchets, and then all the way up. And that's so your kicker's up straight. Kick, down, and then when it comes all the way back up, the spring returns it back up straight. And then just kind of line it on. And you saw that. Now I'm going to put a couple nuts on it and then give it a try. Okay, I have the two nuts snugged up. Now we'll try the clutch. You can see the rod here. You push it all the way in. The rod here, you push it all the way in. Okay, you can see that works good. Now the kicker. I don't have the spring on it, so it's real easy to turn. Now let's see if we can get it to ratchet back. There it is, ratcheting. So you see it comes down. I'll hold the shaft. Ratchets back up without the shaft moving. Down. You can see the sprocket's not turning. That's how you know you're in neutral. So that's all working good. Now we'll put the nuts on and we'll put the spring on. I'm going to put the acorn ones up top where you can see them, and I'm going to put nuts on the bottom because it does take an exhaust bracket down the bottom and it works better with regular nuts. These get lock washers, and of course, you know, I'm going to put some blue Loctite on these. Okay, now I'm going to torque them up. I couldn't find anything in the manual about how tight to torque them. Certain size studs or bolts only take a certain amount of torque. A 5/16 24 stud takes 14 foot-pounds. It's important when you're using a crow's foot that it's 90 degrees from the handle in order to get the right torque. The last thing you have to do is put the spring on. And the hook goes here, this wraps around, you get it in here in this slot that's down here, and then you twist it around like that. And there you have that. And now you can put the kicker on. And the kicker goes on like that. And then your spring brings it back. And that's how it works. So this is a complete assembly of this 53 Panhead transmission. You can see the kicker arm. It's on there and it works. Comes back up straight. This is the clutch arm. When I push the clutch rod in all the way, it's back there. It comes here, and when the clutch basket is here, it'll return it like that. Thank you for watching. I hope you watched the entire video, and I hope it was helpful. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe. I appreciate it. It helps my channel, and it doesn't cost you anything. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments, because I always reply to the questions that I get.